All right, welcome everyone. Good morning. Glad to see you all here this morning. My name's Advas Aldinger. I'm an editor and reporter at Devex. And for those who don't know me, I write a lot about development finance, and so I'm really excited to be hosting a series of conversations this morning about outcomes-based financing. As many of you know, tomorrow there's going to be a high-level dialogue on financing for development at the UN. I'm sure, per usual, as we hear at these events, that there is a huge funding gap and about how we need more money to achieve the SDGs. What I'm excited about today is that we're going to be focusing on how to use the money that we have more effectively. Because not only do we need more money, but the money needs to be used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And so, you know, I think one of the critical things about outcomes-based financing, which is really looking at how do we use data and evidence to drive the decisions that we're making with our development dollars, is that it can allow us in an environment where resources are limited to make the most of what is available. So I'm really excited for a series of great conversations this morning, and I want to thank the UBS Optimus Foundation and Unicef for helping to make this event possible. And to start us off, I wanted to introduce Charlotte Petri-Gornicka, who's the Assistant UN Secretary General and the UNICEF Deputy Executive Director, to welcome us with some opening remarks.
So for those of you who have been here for some days, I think you love these introductory remarks that are long. And you already know a lot of the challenges that I want to share with you. So my name is Charlotte Petri-Gornicka. I'm proud to work for UNICEF. I can still brag about UNICEF because I'm quite new. And I chose to work for UNICEF after many years in the development sector. I headed up the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, a very traditional, but not only, donor agency. And then I went to Paris to cajole with 41 OECD countries on how to deliver on what they agreed with so many others, 2015, on financing the SDGs, from funding to financing. And in UNICEF, I, together with my people, we really want to find the sweet spot where we can, together with you, work in partnership to make sure that investments are happening at scale and that they are happening in the social part of the SDGs as well. I've been spurring a lot of green bonds in my life. I want to see the next movement, which is also about the social part of the SDGs. And we're going to be instrumental in being a partner. And I'm very proud to be co-hosting with UBS. And thank you, Devex, for that too. So why do we need to be very much at the forefront around these issues? You would know that working for children is something that people quite easily engage around. Sometimes they actually think that it's more of a charity to work for children than real change and in-depth political choices have to be made and investments. That's where UNICEF is very important because there are a lot of celebrations on things that have improved for children. But there are so many statistics that I could share with you on what's left to do. You know that there's a funding gap. I can tell you that in just 10 years from now, we will have 2 billion young children, young people in the age between around about 18, 19, a little bit broader than that, who stands on the doorstep to get something useful to do and to contribute in society. They don't know today what that means because we don't know what kind of jobs we need to create for this generation. And that's not only in the developing part of the world, it's actually everywhere, that the right skills, the right enabling environment to become an active citizen, all of that is a very, very big challenge. And a lot of the results for the SDGs are actually in the hands of that generation. In many of the countries we work, over half of the population is under 15. Around about 60% in some of the countries are under 18. So we're not talking about children on the side. We are talking about whole societies. We need to invest, and there is a possible return in that. Before I obviously want to take the opportunity to share with you things that we already do, because I want you to believe that we can be a partner in this. But it's fair to say that agencies like Unicef, as well as governmental agencies, need to reflect internally, how do we change to go from the funding paradigm into catalyzing change and be perhaps more of a convener, where our knowledge, the funding from our donors are the means that we bring to the table to get the investable cases out there. And for an agency like Unicef and many other agencies, this is a change process, but it's happening. It's also important for us to have a long-term view on all of this, because the future for young people and for the fulfillment of the SDGs, the primary responsibility and accountability is with governments. And governments need to have the capacity and the fiscal skills to tap into this market of private money themselves. We should not stand in their way when we do this. We need to pave the way for governments to be in charge of the SDGs. So being a UN agency, we need to be aware of, in the equation of partnership, we need to bring in governments. And we might also ask donors to help governments to build capacity to tap into all of this. That's part of our role. When I came to UNICEF, I was very inspired by the fact that things are happening. Some of the things that we can tell you about is with partners in this room. I'm going to give you just 3-4 examples, and then I'm going to let the meeting start. But one way of working for UNICEF is in Tajikistan. The government has decided to really take a holistic view of how to implement the SDGs from a child rights perspective, which means that 11 out of the 17 SDGs will be met in their plan of action. And UNICEF is now helping them to think about what's needed to make that happen and cost that out. Because, I mean, how do you know what it's going to take unless you break that down and you really think about the cost? And UNICEF is then trying to convene the financiers around this plan. It's not going to be about donor governments funding, and not for Tajikistan. It's not the ODA preferred countries. So it will have to be a pool of solutions. For UNICEF, this takes new capacity to be engineers of financial solutions. You could argue, is that the capacity that we should have? Well, in this project we do, but in the long run, we might want to partner with others to make sure that we can deliver that skill set with the government, but not necessarily turn into financial engineers. But we will have to understand so much so that we can work with you. Because if we don't understand anything, we're going to continue to be funded by donor governments, and we won't reach the targets because the money won't be enough. In UNICEF, we have an innovation lab, a financial innovation lab, where we are now experimenting on how bringing partners like you together. And that includes working with impact bonds, obviously. And we hope that we can drive new efficiencies and attracting new forms of capital and aligning incentives of all actors involved around best results for children. We are asked many times that when you come to the table, you would know how to measure. You would know what kind of change that can be translated into measurements that we, the financer, needs to be able to do this. And right now we are working to identify impact investing opportunities in fragile states as well, which is not as easy. But let me give you an example of what can happen. And so we have situation quite often, and you would know this, that when we spend a lot of money on water in emergencies, trucking in water, it's super expensive, it's difficult many times. But we also know on the other side that it's actually possible to build a business model for predictable, sustainable water in the countries that can be tapped into in an emergency. We don't need to do it the old way, and there are modest returns in that business model. So right now we're trying to pitch this to investors. We are also looking in some countries to see how a development impact bond can support child protection programs, which is about avoiding children to have to separate from their families. It's a very soft social issue. I would say a little bit the hardest to package in an impact bond. But as we speak, we are working with UBS to find a way to make attractive investments in very soft, important social issues. One factor which escapes none in this room is that we can hope to attract new kinds of investors and new forms of capital. Through collaboration, we can begin to grow the pie. That is what this is about. And I have to tell you that there are very many critics out there, and you would know, but some critics say, and governments, recipient governments say, you're trying to shy away from the commitment on ODA by turning into private sector instead. You're not trying to grow the pie. And honestly, there are too few examples yet from donor governments where they really have showed that they grow their pie. They have lowered their ODA, and they have turned into some of these partnerships, and they are not showing that they work in the hardest to reach places. So we will meet some criticism. And one development impact bond won't solve this issue alone, but if we can get social investors to take on risk, contribute to robust results, and enable responsive government, we can collectively make real impact in accelerating achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will be so happy to continue this journey with you, bringing governments from all sides, bringing UN agencies, especially Unicef, hope to be a good partner with you, the investors, and we will lead the change from within and out. And by that, I just want to hand over to our moderator and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Yves Dacour, who's the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I am really looking forward to having, please join me, a conversation with you, in part because you've launched the first humanitarian impact bond. And maybe before we jump into the conversation, we should give people a little bit of background about what that bond looks like, and maybe define sort of for people what your bond is looking at and attempting to do.
Good morning. I think the only reason I'm on stage is the fact that we were maybe to my surprise, we are the only one who have tried to do a bond in a humanitarian setting and being able to do that. The bond, as some of you knows very well, is a very simple tool. So our tool is really not impressive. It's a result-based tool, 5 years, with outcome funders. Most of them are government and social investors who are paying and a return on investment based on result. What was challenging, of course, is the return on investment and what constitute the result that you agree to check and to make sure that social investor will take the risk. So social investor front loan money. There is a result that we have agreed, all the parties together with, of course, third parties to monitor the result. And the results are a bit more sophisticated than just let's make, in fact, it's about physical rehabilitation. Let's make more tools or have more people. We had to look at increase the level of mobility, increase also the performance of staff, having baseline, and then see in 5 years' time what we can do. What I found interesting is that it was not done before. And that maybe is the question, because the tool exists. I mean, development world there is, and maybe the real questions for me is, why is it so difficult to develop a humanitarian impact bond in this environment? And my concern after now 2 years, things works well. So we are developing 3 centers and in difficult places. One is in Mopti, in the Sahel. One is Maiduguri in Lake Chad, and the other was in Kinshasa, Congo. And what was interesting is exactly to develop, in fact, and to use this fund in very difficult places. And I think that's what it is interesting. My question I would ask, and Charlotte, listening to you, is, are we ready as a collective to agree that when we invest in this environment, there are risks, right? And we need to be able to discuss the risk, because that's a bit the concern I have right now. I still feel in a lot of discussions, people are willing to bring private and public sector together, want to move in that directions. But when you start about the risk and discuss seriously, that's another story. So that's still the lessons around that, right?
So tell us a little bit about what progress you've made in the 2 years since the launch. What challenges has this discussion about risk sort of brought for this bond?
To be honest with you, building a bond or building this type of result-based instrument, the issue is not now anymore, it was before. We really struggle to have outcome fund around the table. And here, kudos to some of the government who are ready to do that. To my big surprise, for example, do we have somebody from the Belgian government here? So nobody, so I can speak about it. What was interesting is Belgian government were really interested in why? Because they are mid-size, in fact, donors country. They don't have all the infrastructure, if I may say, the bureaucracy of a big donors. So they were also interested to invest a bit more money and to do that on result base. They had to change their legislation at parliament level to be able to, in fact, pay after 5 years. Also interesting, then you realize when you do a bond, it's not so much about the bond, but you are suddenly challenged or challenging, in fact, the way state, for example, are disbursing money. So that was a big challenge. So they had to be ready. Their prime minister had to vote for it, not so much about money, but says, we are ready to invest and pay on result only after 5 years. They were not able to do that. Big other issues was, of course, and we talk about that, result. What constitutes result? What is your baseline? And when you build a development bond or a bond like that, you need to have the data, which allows you to be able to measure. And that's not easy. And I think we really had to fight against that, to just trying to find exactly where it is. And if I would be honest today, if I look at the ICSC, where we will be able to continue to do a bond will be, of course, on everything related to health or water sanitation. You mentioned that. Much more difficult on other issues because we don't have the data. So the second challenge is the data, absolutely. And the third one still is the risk. Among our social investor, we had Munich Re, which is maybe #1 in the world, as you know, in terms of reassurance. What was good, they came not because they were partner, but they came because they were interested about new markets, which is also a bit of a shock. Why, really? Are we a new market? And I think it's interesting for reassurance. Reassurance, as you know, they have developed a strategy for 100 years on natural disaster, but they look at 2 new markets. One is cyber security, which is important. I don't think they will do any bond here. And the other one was, in fact, war and let's say, unstable environment. And they do that because this is the place, and you mentioned that, which will interest us more and more. Unstable environment, very fragile. This is where we need to focus our energy, both public and private. But to be able to, convince them, they were very good, but convince other social investors to be around the table was difficult. And I think it's interesting, the one who came in were not the bank, were in fact insurance. So we're also the Caixa from Spain and the reassurance from Munich Re. We found it difficult to have other social investors to join in.
So I guess my question from that is what have you learned by building a bond in conflict-affected areas in difficult contexts. As we're looking forward, as people are looking to structure future bonds or other outcomes-based financing instruments, what do they need to do to make that work in these environments? It's very true that in talking about financing the achievement of the SDGs, there has to be more money flowing into these places. Outcomes-based financing is probably going to be part of that solution. So how do you get there? What have you learned that can help sort of push things forward in the future?
So the first lessons, and I know it's a difficult one, it's a lessons about the importance of having a political leadership and will. It will not be based on finance because the return investment versus the risk is not an easy one, right, to be very clear. So I think you need to have, in fact, surprisingly, government willing to move into that because the de-risking question is a central one. So whatever you do, you need to have government willing to put, and have their influence. Doesn't mean only money, but to have their influence. That's central. We will not be able to build, in fact, I think, meaningful, long-term, sustainable financing without government. And I think when governments, sometimes, Charlotte, you mentioned that, might have the temptations to believe that private sectors will take over and they can somewhat withdraw, that's not an option. So it's possible only if they are there and ready to do that and to work around that. So that's one, right? That's clear for me. B, it's also government, just to challenge that, governments also have to reflect a little bit what it means when they're thinking about where they are in terms of sanctions and counterterrorism. I'm sorry to bring that on the table, but it's a very strategic view. So if you think about building, in fact, 5 years or 10 years bond in complex environment, where are we interested? We are interested to do that in Syria, in Yemen, right, to take an example, in South Sudan, in Sahel, in Lake Chad. These are places where you need around education, around water sanitation, around physical rehabilitation. You need, in fact, a real investment over time. But to do that, you need to agree that this investment are also protected. You can shift it based on political constraint or suddenly on counter-terrorist constraint. So point two again, state are important to agree of what are the risks and what does that mean around that. Three, what I found very useful, and this is why I would always push for it, is to be able to think 5 to 10 years. That's remarkable. In the humanitarian setting, we don't do that for good reason. But to be able to discuss and develop and agree on results that you will achieve in 5 years' time, you create, I would say, almost a common grammar, which is very important. A, with, of course, the social investor, your outcome funder, but also with your teams, and importantly, with your clients, the people affected. And I think that's remarkably important because you somewhat agree what you want to achieve. And being able to do that, in our case, it's not just the outcome fund and the outcome funders and then the fund, which is interesting, is also, we have also agreed that we are also bringing some of the learning and technology that we are developing, we will bring that in our 130 other centers. So there is a direct impact around that. So that's also very, very interesting to look into that. So that's, I would say, the 3 level I will look into that. And fourth, maybe as an organization, you also need to challenge your own, in fact, systems. Making sure it's a multi-year performance management and not just a one-year based, making sure your financial system, reporting system are able and are aligned to that.
So I'm going to ask you maybe a bit of a challenging question, because I think there are people who might say...
You feel so far the question were cool.
I think there are people who might say, could you have financed these 3 rehabilitation centers with a simpler mechanism?
The answer is yes.
So why do a bond?
For 2 reasons. Is because I'm deeply convinced, I'm not the only one. I'm convinced that my agenda, the agenda of my organization, the International Committee of Red Cross, will be more and more the agenda of all of us. So I think the idea that you believe that we can contain war, migration, and problems far from our society is over. So I think we will go through the next 10 years, and I hope I'm wrong, through a time which is very difficult, when you have a lot of unstable environments, very close to us, right? Where local government and national government, some places, will not able to provide basic services to its population because they are at war, because they can't. And you can't just have a classical transactions between government or people giving money to humanitarian, which transform that into humanitarian action and report back. That's not good enough. So I think here our objective was, what are the platforms that we're creating that allow others to start to invest and being engaged in this very unstable environment? And then we have a responsibility. We can't complain as humanitarian and look at development actors or as bank or the system and says, why are you not investing in this environment? We need ourselves to put our I would say, know-how, our reputation capitals on the table in order to allow and to learn together to have some platform which allows, in fact, other actors to start to be involved. I know over time in my next, if I project myself next 10 years, this type of financing will represent maximum 10% of, I would say, humanitarian financing. I don't expect more. But it's not the money that is interesting. It's the fact that you have an engagement. It's the fact that entire sectors will start to learn and to qualify the risk. Look at it's interesting to observe that. Look at disaster. Look at natural disaster, how, in fact, the insurance and the reassurance have changed totally the sectors over time. So I think we need to make sure that there is a different way to look at that. And we can't just continue to talk about that only based on two prisms, which is only security or humanitarian. We need also to be able, when we talk about Syria as a good example, or Yemen, we need to also have a reflections about what are the risks, how do you calculate the risk, how you qualify the risk. Do we allow in Syria to have a health system which collapsed totally during the crisis? A water sanitation will collapse totally during the crisis? An education system will collapse during the crisis? You want the Syrian to choose to stay in Syria? We'll have to work on this system, and that can't be the humanitarian. And the development will not come into. So I think there is something around that, which means we have to get outside of our way to try to find the right platform. And that's why it's so interesting to be here today also, because I really think it's a complex environment, but we need to move ahead.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
All right. Well, next, I'd like to ask our panelists to come up on the stage with me, and I'll introduce you guys as you make your way up here. I wanted to introduce Mara Arildi, who's the Director of Government of the Government Outcomes Lab at the Blavatnik School of Government, Asif Saleh, who is the Executive Director of Brac, Caroline Norton-Vance, who's the Director at DWS, and Phyllis Costanzo is the CEO of the UBS Optimus Foundation. Well, I think maybe, Mara, we'll start with you. You are working to sort of curate information about this space. And one of the things I'd sort of like to ask you about is how would you sort of define outcomes-based financing and then the current outcomes-based financing landscape? Where do you think we stand? What is the understanding of these issues?
Can I start by checking with the audience how many of you are familiar with the concept of outcome-based financing? Okay, most of you are very familiar. Very good. I think in terms of where we stand, there has been a lot of experimentation. There are many instruments out there, and at the University of Oxford, we are zooming in impact bonds as the bleeding edge of innovation, but they sit in a landscape of many instruments. I think it's time to start to share more information, to have a learning attitude about what is working and not working in this design. There is no one-fits-all solution. So we need to have this openness and try not to reinvent the flat wheel. So people have tried things. Some of them work, some didn't. Can we share this knowledge openly? And can we compare instruments with the alternative? It seems that there is a lot of attention put on the new toy, and we criticize how much time it takes to do it, how much it costs. And we don't pay attention to the cost of doing nothing, the cost of alternative mechanisms. So everybody says, oh, doing an impact bond takes so much time, it's so expensive. It is probably true. But doing nothing, how much does it cost that? Do we know? So I think where we stand now, I think we are at a stage where there are enough experimentation happening. There is an appetite to share this information. So can we create more learning faster so that when we design new mechanism, we are starting a step ahead? And so I think we are ready to put this information out there and try to build on it and have some lessons learned. There will not be like off-the-shelf instruments that you can apply here and there, but can we develop that nuanced understanding that given these conditions and this problem, this is the route that is more likely to lead to impact. I think we are ready to start this journey.
Great. And Phyllis, I want to come to you next because at UBS, you have really been trying to help build this space in the development finance world. And you have put an emphasis on sharing that information and an openness about the DIBs that you're helping to fund and have put money behind sort of sharing those learnings. And so I want to ask you sort of why you've done that work? Why are you engaged? Why do you think this is a critical piece of the development finance conversation? And what are some of the key things that you've sort of learned along the way in the last few years?
I think one of the key things, and maybe no, it is on. Yes, great. What we're trying to do at UBS through the UBS Optimus Foundation, but also through our entire philanthropy team, is bring more money and better money to solve some critical problems. And we're trying to bring new money. If you look at the trust in NGOs right now, it's anywhere between 40% to 52% of people trust nonprofits for a variety of reasons. But we will never achieve the SDGs unless we get that number up. And when I look at our clients, especially our clients right here in the US, only 4% of them are funding programs out of the US. And that is because they don't trust it. They don't know where their money is going. They don't know if it's ever going to get to the people who need it, particularly in really resource-poor, remote settings. So impact bonds, as I always like to say, while impact bonds or outcome-based financing may not be the thing, it might be the thing to the thing. So we're really trying to demonstrate and prove to our clients, and UBS banks half the world's billionaires, so there's a lot of money there, that they can invest in things that have a real impact. And we're trying to teach them also what is impact and how does that drive outcomes. And then if you want to achieve the SDGs, you've got to drive outcomes at scale. And how do we get there? Well, you know, this is just one way to tap into the $295 trillion in the capital markets that may be available. And one last thing is I'm going to make a plug for this around my wrist, which is, represents SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. And all right, probably the least sexy SDG, maybe, no, the coolest SDG, which is why I wear it. And at UBS, we're partnering with Bottle Top, trying to promote the SDGs amongst our clients and everybody. And that's what this display is here. Each sustainably made band represents one SDG. And you can buy them at togetherband.org. There.
Thanks, Phyllis. Asif, I want to come to you next. Brac is a massive NGO. And I know that you're thinking about an impact bond and working to design one. Obviously, the funding landscape for NGOs like Brac is changing. Tell us a little bit about why Brac is looking to impact bonds as part of the funding solution.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with Brac, we are headquartered in Bangladesh, but it's one of the largest NGOs, which not a lot of people know about. But interestingly, we started in Bangladesh, but we now have about close to 100,000 staff across in 12 countries. And to make your point, I think one very practical reason we're looking at it, the way Brac sort of works at scale, at very large scale. We are used to also a very diversified, very large size funding. And that funding landscape, you're absolutely right, is changing quite dramatically. And as more and more countries are graduating to become middle-income countries, also people are focusing more on a very few countries. But the needs are changing as well. Social needs are changing as well. So how do we bring in new source of funding in there? And I think that's a very clear practical reason where we can pull in a lot of different sources of funding together to achieve a common goals and common vision. So from that perspective, it's very important that the private sector capital actually comes in. And I think one other reason we were very interested because there's a lot of talk about partnership that happens, right? Both in country and outside. And oftentimes what happens is these kinds of partnership talks are mostly around events and other things. I think this financing arrangement actually ties it all together in a sense that there's a common purpose. We're all working on this together. And I also agree, the previous speaker said that if we can bring in government to the table, and then this whole public-private social partnership has a very common unified goal. I mean, for example, I'll tell you, I was just here at the global board meeting of Generation Unlimited 2 days ago, which is a global initiative that currently Unicef is incubating. And there are phenomenal group of private sector partners, all the big multilaterals are there. And World Bank just, for example, committed about $1 billion to this initiative. And half of it is in the first 3 countries, they're allocating in 3 countries, half of it is going to Bangladesh. As an initial, so about $500 million. So, but when we engage with World Bank on this conversation in terms of this money would go to the government, some of it money will go to the NGOs, but they're not really looking at it as a impact bond, right? They're looking at it more like a traditional project. So if we could have brought this in this impact bond landscape, then the conversation that we would be having with the government, the conversation that we would be having with other partners, private sector, would have a very specific goal. Here we are trying to get skills training to this many number of people, and at least 70% or 80% should get jobs. Employable skills should be there. Child marriage should be reduced. So those are the kind of things that are measurable, that can be done. But my concern is that it's probably too early or whatever. The conversations are happening still on very silos. So the conversation I'm having at Generation Unlimited that doesn't talk about impact bonds at all. So I think we need to mainstream it. In our experience in the last couple of years, we found that the education or understanding of the impact bond space varies across. I mean, when we go to the head office, there are greater awareness, but at the country level, there are far less awareness. So they're much more of a skeptic. So as a result, what happens is that, very difficult to get traction on some of this conversation. We were working with ABHA and British Asian Trust, who's here, knows, but I think times are changing. I think things are again moving, but more and more education and donor awareness is needed. But my hope is that as more and more sort of organization gets more specialized in these various sort of areas of how to kind of construct or structure these kinds of funding. And one of the big criticism about these kinds of funding is the transaction cost is very high. So that's going to start to get down and lower. And so for us, of course, it will always only make sense if the financing is large enough because of all the sort of complexity that is in the bond and also the transaction cost. Thank you.
Caroline, I want to turn to you next. You represent the private sector on this panel. And I think that there's a lot of talk about how impact bonds and results-based financing can help mobilize additional private capital. And I'm wondering, as you look at the outcomes-based landscape, how you see this sort of push for outcomes impacting your work or perhaps the impact investing field or the finance field, and where you think the private sector can realistically plug in?
Wow, that's a lot of questions in one, and I'm feeling a lot of pressure representing the private sector up here. Yes, I think that's fair to say. So maybe just to say a word about the organization I work for. DWS is the asset management arm of Deutsche Bank, and I work for the Sustainable Investments Group within DWS. And this is a group that was formed to create funds that have environmental or social outcomes associated with them. And our mandate is to create these funds at scale. So yes, I represent the private sector, but I think also I represent a very particular role within the private sector that is fully on board with impact investing and trying to increase its reach in the world. And when you think about the scale of what needs to be done to achieve the SDGs, I think the asset management industry in general has a very obvious role to play, considering the massive amounts of assets under management that it intermediates. Right now, I think there's still sort of a scarcity of products that can be launched at scale that are credibly mapped to the SDGs. Although I think that's starting to change. As Phyllis was saying, that the outcomes-based financing instruments that have been launched so far, maybe they're the thing to the thing. I think absolutely the rigor that they have brought to how to think about outcomes and how to connect the financial returns to the outcomes, I think that's absolutely critical for how impact investing sort of grows and maintains its credibility. I think one of the most exciting things that's happened this year in the impact investing space is the launch of the operating principles for impact management, which are currently housed at IFC. There's, I think, more than 60 signatories already, including some very mainstream names. The idea there is to create some standardization around what it means to be an impact investment manager, so that an investor who wants to achieve an outcome while receiving a financial return through their investment, they know exactly what to expect in terms of the rigor around the outcomes, tracking, measurement, and reporting. And so I think in that way, the kind of outcomes-based financing movement is very important in sort of inspiring that rigor and bringing it into the mainstream.
Sure. Yeah, wonderful. One of the things that I wanted to just throw out there is I think there are questions about whether private finance is going to jump in on some of these instruments, whether it'll mobilize new capital. I know that's something that we've talked about before, Phyllis. I know it's something you're working on closely, but I think there is this question. So you're doing a lot of this work out of the foundation. Is the bank going to come in as an investor on these deals in the future? How are you building out those instruments to get sort of the more commercial capital engaged?
Well, if we look at the sector right now in outcomes-based financing, it's about $650 million, and it's growing at about the same pace that venture capital grew in the 80s. And also, if you look at how private equity got started, it also started with the same moans and groans about the complexity of it. It will never be scaled, and that's why the founders of KKR left. I think they were at Bear Stearns to start their own fund because they really believe this could scale. So I think that we have to believe that this is possible. We have to go straight forward and charge ahead. And UBS believes this. They took a risk. It was a big risk when we funded the first development impact bond with Educate Girls. And it was tiny. And we used UBS money, not client money. It was $270,000. And what happened is that on the back of that now, Educate Girls has raised more than $75 million because it demonstrated from a $270,000 grant, basically loan, however you want to call it, it taught them, it showed to other donors how critically important the work was and how for a very small marginal cost over what the government was paying, they could achieve outcomes. And so we are structuring more blended finance products now to look at whether or not we can do these at scale. And we've been working with a number of bilateral donors who are committing a minimum of $100 to $200 million in an outcomes fund. And then we're structuring a blended finance mechanism around that.
And are you getting commercial investors or institutional investors expressing interest or committing to those new instruments?
Yes, we do have pension funds and also insurance companies who are interested in which is surprising to us. But there is a lot more interest, and we're seeing tremendous amount of growth, especially from our wealthy private clients.
So my challenge is, whenever we talk about impact bonds, I often hear this discussion as a technical, like financial instrument discussion. And so it's a product, and there are technical challenges. But then when you look at the lessons we learned to date, it seems the design of the instrument is something you can learn, and you can learn quickly. But the key challenge is building the relationships. So even if you take Educate Girl, we're trying to replicate it in other places. And the time it takes to build a relationship, that's not shorter. So I think having a good understanding of what is the necessary regulatory framework that you need to have, and go into these things with your eyes open. And also, we need to have the outcome funder on board. Project over project, we see it was very difficult to have the outcome funder on board. Why was that? And so we need to go into these deals thinking there is a relational aspect, and that will require time. I don't think that the time it takes will go down significantly in terms of building the relationship. The time to come to the agreement on the contract might go faster because we have example to copy from, but building the relationship, it might come before, it might be a precondition. Sometimes when I look at these contracts, I think this is a relationship. And if you think about your personal relationship, if the relationship is not there and it's difficult, you don't get married with somebody if the relationship is difficult, let alone you have a baby. So I think you need to build the relationship first. And when there is a healthy relationship, there is a functioning ecosystem, then this instrument can play a role. But sometimes we underplay, like recognizing what is the ecosystem that lends itself to this instrument, and when you should use a grant or just work on the relationship and building the local capacity of the system. Like this nuanced understanding, sometimes we take it for granted, but I think often is what made the success or the failure of this project, that you went in, you had all the technical assistance, but it was the wrong moment, the wrong place.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So I think, in a sense, I would not be able, not all projects can come under impact bonds. I mean, there's some projects require much longer patient capital. They're talking about behavior changes. It's talking about gender equality and other things. You know, these are very long-term game, right? So that's number one. Number two is, I think you also probably, then it's important that what stage of the project actually you are taking on. So, for example, the project that we are working on, that has relevant, in structuring a potential impact bond, we have sufficient scale, but not large enough. But we are fairly comfortable at that scale. The relationships are built. So it's a matter of scaling that up further, scaling up the impact we were talking about before the break, scaling up the impact and the similar context. So we felt comfortable that this is an area where we're feeling sufficiently confident that if additional capital comes in, then we can go in. But if you had asked me something else completely different in a very post-conflict country where there's so many unknowns, I would be hesitant on getting that kind of financing there. So that would be, my preference would be like regular grants.
So I think I want to dig a little bit more into this question of scale. And I'd like to hear maybe from each of you about what you think are the sort of key roadblocks right now to sort of scaling up the results-based financing space. There's a lot of issues. We can go in a lot of places, but I think you each sort of bring an interesting perspective. So I don't know, Phyllis, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think what we're seeing right now is there's There's several roadblocks, of course, and hurdles that we have to overcome, but the two biggest ones that we've seen are organizational culture and IT. You cannot go to a very traditional implementing organization which does not have an entrepreneurial spirit and expect them to implement an outcomes-based financing mechanism. It will not work. There many nonprofits, actually, they don't hire people who are incredibly entrepreneurial, willing to go out and test and try new things, and immediately pivot and change direction if something's not working. That's the first thing. The second thing is every nonprofit who tries to implement an outcome-based financing mechanism needs to have a really robust IT system. A strong performance management system, which is not normal in the nonprofit sector. Any for-profit business knows every day whether or not they made a profit or not. It would be unthinkable for them not to know this. But in the nonprofit sector, we don't know. You do an evaluation a year later, and maybe we know if it worked or if it didn't work. And that will not work with outcomes-based financing. You have to know every day, every week, whether or not you're having an impact.
I'm really glad you brought up that point, because in talking to Educate Girls, I think one of the most interesting outcomes of that bond was not only that it achieved its goals, but it transformed the organization. And I think that's a piece of this conversation that is often not discussed as much, that it's really has a transformative impact on the way development is done. And that means not just for the part of their organization that was working on the DIB, that across the organization, things changed. Their systems changed. But that's also one of the hardest parts of it was for the organization. And talking to Safina, that was a real challenge to get people behind that. And Asif, I want to ask you this question, because you're thinking, and Brac is a big organization. And so I'm curious to hear from you how you think engaging in an impact bond would change the way you work. What sort of systems would you need to build? Is there an internal willingness? What sort of preparation do you need to make internally to be able to engage?
I absolutely agree with Phyllis that you definitely need a very strong IT system, M&E system. So the one and looking at our own organization, I don't think all the very different programs, not everybody is ready for that. So we picked the program which is already is doing real-time data collection, digitized data collection. They have a very robust system in terms of doing the monitoring and evaluation that it does. And at the same time, I think, it's not that log frame-based work is not outcome-oriented. They also have outcomes. I just want to be absolutely clear. But I think where the big difference is that if you don't achieve your outcome, the worst thing that can happen is you may get a tap on your shoulder and say that, okay, next term you'll get a reduced funding, or that kind of conversation happens. As opposed to here, the incentives are dramatically changed. That conversation basically changes, like the example you gave, that because you're so focused on the outcome, and if the outcome is not met, then you potentially are going to lose a whole lot of amount that can put a lot of things at risk. So I think that changes those conversations. So I think it will be a cultural shift. We are, in terms of Brac itself is very rigorous in terms of looking at impact and other things. So in a sense, but I think just to put a bit of a grain of salt here is that there's another form of outcome-based, results-based financing we're seeing. For example, bilaterals are giving it to various management consulting organizations. They're outsourcing their work as well, right? So that we have had mixed experience with, in a sense, because that understanding of social challenges, the fact that some of the things actually require time and that patient capital is required. That understanding within these organizations are not quite there. So as a result, oftentimes it becomes a very numbers-driven, ticking the box kind of discussion, and which prevents any conversation around innovation or learning and other things. We have seen that not just our organization, and sometimes the relationship gets very, very confrontational. So I think the good thing about this is that in the impact bond, and we will probably learn as we go along, is that the conversations around outcomes takes a long time to drill down, but by the time everybody is aligned, you will have a lot of clarity in terms of where you want to go. So you actually prepare accordingly. You have those conversations up front rather than later on when it becomes too late. So yeah, absolutely right. There will be a bit of a cultural shift as well.
Great. I wanted to talk a little bit about data and measurement, because data and measurement really underpin everything that we're talking about. And without sort of those robust systems to be able to measure and evaluate the impact and the outcomes, you don't have a successful sort of growth of the field. And so I'm curious from you, and actually maybe Caroline, will start with you, because I think there are interesting sort of conversations that are happening in the outcomes-based financing space that are also happening in the impact investing space around how do we more effectively, more efficiently, more economically measure and evaluate impact. And so where do we stand, and sort of what do we need? What do you think these two fields can sort of learn from each other?
That's a tough question. I think we've been talking about impact measurement in impact investing for like 20 years, like on a loop that just keeps going.
How do we break that loop?
Gosh, I wish I knew. Well, I think fortunately the loop seems to be kind of like zeroing in a little bit more. So we're not just spinning anymore. We're actually maybe spinning towards something. But seriously, though, it is a really big challenge. But I think in line with the launch of these principles this year, I think at least we now have agreement from parties that can move significant amounts of money in impact investing, that it's important. So we've all agreed that impact measurement is important. No one can hide from that anymore and say it's too difficult. We don't know how to do this. The fact is that it's yes, maybe it requires a change in how you are organized as an institution. But it's not that difficult. You just have to do it, and you have to have the will at kind of a senior level to push it through. So I think we're finally there. I don't think it requires an incredibly rigorous amount of new systems to actually be able to do credibly. I think that it can be done with very straightforward tools that probably every large financial institution has within their wherewithal. So I think that we've finally broken down the wall of, oh, this is too hard. This is for somebody else to do. I think that's been taken on board by the impact investing space, which is a huge milestone. I kind of wanted to come back. I don't know if this is out of line, but I wanted to come back to the scale question a little bit, please. Because I wanted to maybe ask a bit of maybe a devil's advocate question. If we're talking about sort of SDG achieving levels of scale, is outcomes-based financing kind of is that an appropriate goal for outcomes-based financing to achieve that type of scale? And I ask because of the complexity involved that we've discussed, but also because if we are talking about that level of money, and we will need to bring to the table some of these more traditional investors. And at least in my personal experience, expecting them to change sort of the way that they think about investments in a totally new way, I think might be a bridge too far. And so I wonder if it's more a more appropriate goal to see outcomes-based financing as a way to build the evidence base, as a way to build up the capacity of service providers, and then to kind of allow the scale to be built on top of that through other impact investment type vehicles, through blended finance structures and of that sort, just to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't think any of us on this panel, I'm sorry, I'm speaking for you, so correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't believe that outcome-based financing is going to fill the $2.5 trillion annual gap. There's no way. But what it does is it brings in some more people who might not trust funding in this space, and it's pushing this concept of impact, which is critical for the SDGs. So I do think that it has an important role to play, but no, I don't think the goal for anybody is that it's going to fill the gap. I think you're absolutely right.
I agree. Great. I wanted to pick up on something that Yves said earlier, and he was talking about how the Belgian government had to change some of its rules to be able to invest in their bond. And I think that there's a fundamental question that also needs to be asked about donor governments and their ability within their current funding structures to actually fund in this way, in an outcomes-based way, because a lot of them don't necessarily have the ability to pay at the end of 5 years. You're seeing some of them experiment with interesting structures. Mara, I know you've looked a lot at the UK context and at some of the work DFID is doing in this space. And so I wonder how, are we seeing some change? What is it going to take is it going to require legislation in other environments or policy change to really scale this up?
I think having the right regulatory framework is really important. I said it 3 times. Because whenever you look at lessons learned, the struggle is, we need to look for legal advice, and it was not possible to procure in this way, because it's a way to procure services. But if there is a will, there is a way. And we've seen changes in the legislation to accommodate this. So the point is, it is a challenge, or maybe, I'm the glasses are full type of person, and I think there is, if you want to do something, there is a way. And so we've seen example, the Belgian government with the decree passed to allow this to happen. In Colombia, where again, there is a problem with the timing of payment. So can we pay the first outcomes so they happen in the early years, and then somebody else steps in for later payments? Or in Europe, we've seen the use of structural funds, and there was some kind of acrobatics happening for the structural fund to be used to support impact bonds in a European context. And now the legislation is changing. So I think if there is a way, you need to look into that, and you are on a journey. But I think the changes in legislation happens if there is a political will.
Wonderful. In just a minute, we're going to come to all of you for some questions, so get your questions ready. I do have one other question for you, and I think it's important when we think about outcomes-based financing and DIBs and some of these more complex instruments to talk about when they should be used and when they shouldn't. And so one of the questions I have for you is when is a DIB not the right tool?
Do you want me to start? Okay.
Sure.
A DIB is not the right tool for programs that have that seek long-term outcomes. For instance, advocacy programs, and we heard also on gender equality issues. These are long-term struggles that we've got to fight, and it's very difficult to measure the outcomes. And so I do see people. We get calls all the time from nonprofits saying, we want to structure a DIB, here's what we're doing. And most of these are not at all appropriate because they have there's no way to measure their impact. Or more importantly, the impact that they want to measure creates perverse incentives, which is really key for this. You have to make sure that what you're measuring doesn't actually corrupt the whole program. And we saw that with Educate Girls, where we decided to create the outcome that we were measuring was change in learning. And if we just measured it on test scores, for instance, we would have incentivized them to get the girls who lived close to the school, who had been in and out of school for years, but basically they could read. But instead, by looking at the change in learning outcomes, it incentivized Educate Girls to go way out to some of the most remote places. Because when a girl can't read or a boy can't read, then getting them to a place where they can read one sentence, that's a huge delta. And so it really created the incentive for them to find the hardest to reach girls.
So I want to give an example of when you might want to use them. And I think there are three main reasons why you might want to consider impact bond. One is when you want to innovate, the Educate Girl example, like we want to try and change something, we want to see if it works. And you really bring in this monitoring and evaluation, really intensive, and you want to see if it works. Very difficult to do otherwise. And so there is a risk that is a total failure and is a learning ambition and a change worth looking at them. Two, some preventative program in the short term, not in 15 years horizons, where you need to tap into some more patient capital, and so there is no capital available and there is some risk. I can't use this money because I don't have right now. I'm dealing with a problem and I don't have the budget. So can I tap into patient capital to reduce the scale of the problem if in 2-3 years I can recover some of the cost? So that makes sense because you access these patient capital. And if you want to stimulate, if you want to create and strengthen an ecosystem where you want to different agencies working together, often those instruments are used where there is no single agency that has the solution to the problem. And so you need them to coordinate and work together. Very difficult to do it by issuing 5 different contracts. So you issue one and say, I want to see the outcome. You now go and figure it out. But there is always a risk transfer element in all I've said. So unless there is a risk transfer, like I don't see why this should happen. And there's a risk transfer in terms of the financial risk or the implementation risk. The reputational risk is never transferred. So it is a caution there. It's not that all the risks are contracted out.
Great. Well, now we'll turn to you. We have time for some questions. All right, let's start back there.
Hello, thank you so much for your comments. My name is Olga Labelle with MasterCard. So far, we talked a lot about working with nonprofits and outcomes-based financing. I'd love to hear your thoughts about where the private sector can get involved, or conversely, where we shouldn't be getting involved.
Should I take that as
We're going to take 3 questions and then we'll go back.
Should we ask other questions or wait for?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Amin Hilal from the Islamic Development Bank. Yeah, just one question about the additionality. I would like to know, how do you think that actually by investing in the impact bonds, private sector is bringing additional money to the SDGs? And just to explain better my point, if we're shifting the risk to the private sector and we're paying return to the private sector, are we actually adding additional grant money, especially when we're talking about DIBs and HIBs, because they are grant-based? Are we adding additional money from the private sector to achieve the underlying purpose, or not really? So my question is as well, how can the private sector contribute more to these structures or to the underlying objective we're trying to achieve?
Do we have other questions? Might as well go there. We'll come over here next time.
Thank you. My name is Angelica Mendes-Launi from Women's World Banking. And I have a question about the impact. Do you see a difference in the impact achieved when using development impact bonds as opposed to the traditional donor funding, the grant funding? Thank you.
Great. So we've got 3 questions, one about where the private sector to engage, which Caroline, maybe you want to jump in on that one. Question on the additionality and whether we're actually adding in additional capital or how private sector can contribute more, and if we're seeing a difference in impact.
Okay, so as the private sector representative, I think what I said before, I think I still stand by that. If the private sector can be very effective, I think, on the scaling side of the coin, and my personal view is that the highly structured outcomes-based financing instruments that exist, or as they exist today, I think are best used as building the evidence base for scale to be built on top of that in the future. And I'm less familiar with ways in which the private sector can put philanthropic capital into outcomes-based financing, but that certainly seems like an appropriate place to play. But in terms of more traditional finance, I would really see that as being most powerful when it's building up something that has already been proven through a rigorous outcomes-based financing intervention. And that's where it can kind of be most powerful, crowd in more private sector finance. That's my personal view. And again, that's not really speaking to the philanthropic capital side of it, which maybe Phyllis has more to say about.
I think the private sector has a big role to play, and I agree that to scale these up, it might not be a pure outcomes mechanism. I think it's more of a blended finance mechanism, because large institutions want to make sure that if they're investing in this, somebody's de-risking that for them. So we are looking at more blended finance, and I do think that is a way to scale these. So how can the private sector get involved? You can come alongside us. We're trying to test out a new way to tap into the capital markets. And there is $294 trillion out there. There is room for some of this to go towards issues where there may not be a market. And so I think the private sector, instead of doing, traditional CSR, put some more money into this, because you can recycle these funds if it works.
Does someone want to take the question on on whether we're seeing sort of different levels of impact between sort of outcomes-based financing and more traditional grants?
Yeah, that's an easy one. We don't know. The evidence is building up. So at the moment, we have some example where this seems to be the case. So if you take the work of Educate Girls, you can see they were working under a grant before, and they were doing things. They meant well. They thought they were working, and then because they brought in these intensive monitoring and evaluation, they changed what they did in a way they wouldn't have done otherwise, and they achieved more impact. But then if you talk to them, will you do an impact bond next? And they said, no, we'll stick with the grant now, because it was a lot of work to refine the way we work. But we might go back to it if we want to reconsider what we're doing and if we think it's not working as well as we thought. So there are some evidence if you take a single case, but then in aggregate, does it work? I think the evidence is building up. Anecdotal evidence says that people who work in an impact bond say, I now know, just even by doing the design and talking to people about what do we mean by outcome, how do we know we're achieving it, that brings a cultural change and this willingness to be out there and say, there is a reputational risk there, you're out there, and if it doesn't work, everybody will see that you are wasting your time. So that takes courage, and it's really a cultural shift, and we need to live in an organization that celebrate the learning, even when it's not working. You say, good to know. If we didn't know, we would have continued doing it. But it takes a particular culture of really meaning, we really care for impact. And if we really mean it, when it doesn't work, we celebrate that we know. But it's very easy then to be accused. So does it work? The evidence is building anecdotally, lots of enthusiasm in organization where there is the right culture.
Great. We'll take a few more questions. Let's come over to this side. We're bringing, oh, all right. We'll start with one over here. We'll come over there.
This sort of probably leads on from what you're saying. Anne-Marie O'Connor from the New Zealand Sovereign Wealth Fund. We've been involved in a social impact bond. Now, if you're really wanting institutions to be involved, I agree, it has to be really boring, right? This is very exciting, what you're talking about, but we like boring. We want really exciting outcomes. But it's not just us where it needs to be boring and normal. It's the government, right, and the donor community. And I do get the sense that governments are really skeptical, right? And you know, it's really just not worth our effort if the other side doesn't really want the money. So how do you get this to be normalized in the government? And it comes to that partnership level, but it also comes to the political risk. Because we can't just reconvert our CSR funds. They still have to make a return, but we'll lower the return we need if the risk is understood and it's boring, and it survives changes in whoever the minister is and whoever is actually on the relationship side. So what work with governments is there to make this sort of scalable for us?
Thank you. Yeah. Yes. I think we have an answer for you.
Thank you for that boring question. So we're talking about that we all need to change. And one of the things that you should know about the ecosystem is that there are actors. We talk about NGOs here, but we should also talk about UN agencies. They are not NGOs. They are working on behalf of governments. And the role of UN agencies like UNDP, Unicef, there are too many of us, if you ask me. But when we are coordinated, which we are really working hard on being, we are there to help governments to implement the SDGs, meaning we should be convening. We should be helping out. And we should know the system. So which donor government do guarantees? When do you talk to some donor governments in the cluster when you do this? And which are the countries that really understand that, yes, it's boring, but we need to do this, and we need to know more about fiscal. We have to invest in our fiscal capacity because we want to tap into the capital market while we build our tax system. And that's for UN agencies to chip in. So count on us.
Thank you. All right. We have a question in the back there and then one in the front here.
I'm Will Center. I'm with Philips. And first of all, on behalf of the private sector, I could say very confidently that outcomes-based financing or performance-based contracting is all mainstream. This is what we do. But in the development space, we are very actively trying to develop a number of primary care projects in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're finding that when we talk to impact investors, there's really no return on the projects that we're looking for, particularly in the last mile of development. And so, you know, it's very hard. I mean, it's a challenge. So it's very hard to make the case for a return. So what's missing is really metrics where we can prove greater impact, lower costs, and basically a more efficient use of the capital. And so my question is, I was interested to hear about the operating principles for impact investment at the IFC. At the IFC, are they also trying to come up with common metrics? Because, you know, if different companies are going around talking to different foundations and whatnot, trying to raise funds for worthwhile projects, and each of them have used metrics that are slightly different, it slows the process down. And so my question is there work going forward to try to standardize the metrics for impact investment, because that's what we need, because we won't be able to prove a profit or a return on investment, but we can prove impact. Thank you.
Great. Front row.
Hi, I'm Pompey. I'm the India Director for Merck for Mothers, and we have partnered for one of the DIBs. I do feel that there is an inherent difference or complexity between healthcare, education, and financial inclusion problems, and how investments or grant or CSR money can handle all of these And I wanted to understand from the esteemed panel as to how are impact bonds looking at these complexities across these three streams, and how do you think the solutions evolve as far as outcome-based, results-based financings are concerned?
Great. Do people want to? Okay, maybe we'll take one last very quick question.
Thanks a lot. I'll be quick. I'm Product Basu with the Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. So we've talked a lot about outcomes funding, and essentially outcomes funding, strictly speaking, is a substitution of what would have been a revenue stream in a private investment. And the question I guess I would have is, since you're substituting revenue streams, haven't heard much about the actual investing in actual private delivery models that actually would have a returnable revenue stream that then could be shared between the delivery entity and then the investor, as you would have in a classic private equity transaction. In the healthcare space, when you combine that with the fact that you've got so much delivery being done in the private sector, malaria control alone, $650 million per annum in out-of-pocket payments. Just I'd love to hear a little bit more about how one can not just substitute for outcomes payments, but actually lockbox a portion of the revenue from an actual for-profit endeavor.
Great. You can take the first question.
About the standardization of metrics. I think this is an interesting point, and I think it makes perfect sense. So one of the things that various institutions like the University of Oxford with the Go Lab or with Brookings, the Education Outcome Fund, we are trying to do it once and do it well so that you have something to take and use. You can adapt, but we need to learn which metrics have worked in the past, which one turned out to be stupid. Because sometimes you put in place a metric and you don't realize what happens on the ground and you think, oh boy. So can we know why that's the case? Can we share that learning? So we are trying to curate a bank of outcome metric from different sectors. As a university, I can put them out and in one place, but I need to rely on institutions like, we will hear from Amel in a second, the Education Outcome Funds. They design this metric and they can learn what is working, what is not. And the idea is that through some standardization, we can speed up the process.
And just to add on to that, there is definitely a lot of work on standardization of outcomes metrics being done by the GIN. They have a program called IRIS Plus that's been recently launched, and the goal of that project is to do exactly this. And they're attempting to map to the SDGs and to all of the credible work that's being done in different sectors, so that you can go to IRIS Plus and say, I'm interested in education. It'll provide you with a few different theories of change that you can choose from. And then they'll suggest, okay, based on your impact thesis, here are the outcomes metrics that we recommend. So it's still kind of under construction for some sectors, but it's out there. I would recommend taking a look. And the SDGs themselves, there's so many indicators that are connected with each of the principles. Of course, they're not it's not entirely clear how you turn that from kind of a national goal into an actionable impact metric. But that's what IRIS Plus is trying to do, and some of the other work is. And when we map to the SDGs, for example, we do make the effort to try to trace through the common UN indicator, so that at least we can sort of defend the logic chain there. And thank you for correcting me at the beginning. And I've been speaking about the private sector as though it's quite monolithic. So for some private sector investors, outcomes-based financing is what was the word you used? Mainstream, yeah.
And the GIN is the Global Impact Investing Network, lest we use acronyms that people don't know.
And I can't remember what IRIS stands for. I'm sorry. Impact something.
I want to just take on the first one a little bit and the third question. I want to kind of challenge you on that there is no money to be made on the last mile. I think there is return, but you just have to wait a bit longer. I think Brac, for example, started a bank targeting the small and medium sector enterprises when no one would lend them, right? And now, after 15 years, we are the highest profit-making bank in Bangladesh, Brac Bank. And same with some of our social enterprises. That early stage, you have to use grant money or whatever to build a market. And then over time, because of the sheer volume, you actually make a lot of money, in a sense. And that's one of our big financing strategy. And that comes to where your question is, what you're talking about is more around this whole impact investment space. So how do you invest in some of these social enterprises to actually get a return as well? And my experience has been with this particular space has been that as I was saying, the impact investors still are very eager to get quick returns. They want 10% return in 5 years or 7 years at the most. But I think if you are really looking at making a double bottom line, social return and financial return, you have to wait a bit more longer term, have a more longer term view around 10, 12 years before you start to see much bigger return in the longer term. I mean, for example, in one of our enterprises, is mobile financial service. IFC is a big investor. Gates Foundation is an investor. And recently, Alibaba has become an investor itself. But again, these all started with some level of grant money, but then which helped us to build a market. And then eventually, we got a lot of traditional investors to come in and help it scale up. Thank you.
Wonderful. We are basically at time for our panel. Do you have one last very quick thought, Phyllis?
I think you can do this with a for-profit also, bottom line, particularly in healthcare. And if anybody can help structure it, you're the guy. So put your thinking cap on.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful conversation. And I wanted to introduce Alma Karbel, who's the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund, and she's going to close us out with some closing remarks that'll hopefully leave us with some food for thought. Alma, please come up.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed listening. These are my closing remarks, so I'll hope I put them in a better structure way. Without offending everyone at the end. But I have to run out, so there is little risk for me. So I think I've heard few things. So one is that spending more money in what is not working right now doesn't probably make a lot of sense. So it makes also the case for turning around the burden of proof. We hear this all the time. I've been the CEO and building the plane while flying for the last 2 years of a $1 billion outcomes fund for education. And I ask them, look, if nothing changes by 2030, half of the world children are going to be failing to learn just to take the education. So tell me that what we're doing right now is working. So the risk of business as usual is higher potentially than the risk of doing these new things. Now, the question is, and we've heard that, we've heard also Mara saying that about, do we have to reinvent the wheel every time? When we started, now there are around 160 impact bonds. There are many more results-based financing contracts out there. When we started building the fund, I went in like easy peasy, thinking, wow, there are 130 there. I'm going to just take the best learning and then build off it, and discover that actually most of them have been done in a very transactional manner, deal by deal, which I do understand for every single contract. But at the end, there has been very little public knowledge created. And so kind of instead of starting actually to work on it, we spent the first year trying to build public knowledge, and a bit of advertisement here. We have a 250-page book now that we're happy to share with everyone around what we've learned around how to commission for outcomes, how to price outcomes, how to define outcomes, how to deal with risk, how to monitor and evaluate perverse incentives, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm happy to see, Oxford GovLab and together potentially with Brookings and others to put all this knowledge out there. If you try today to get all these contracts, you won't be even able to get some of them. So I think this let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's not be like headless chicken doing today one on health, tomorrow on education, and then on WASH with a new investor, a new outcome funder, a new service provider every time, and take 2 years to learn it. And instead of saying, okay, let's do what venture capital did, as long as one investor invested in one tech company, it went nowhere. the actually tech revolution happened when venture capital funds were created. So let's try to create results-based or outcomes fund that are big, that are in one sector, and that people learn about the metrics. When they do the next project, we see it now. Our first was in Ghana. It took us like 1.5 years to design. We're moving it to Sierra Leone. It takes us 1/4 of the time and less than 1/3 of the cost potentially. So you can see this learning. And I hope that tomorrow there are thousands of these funds in the different areas. So I think that's one point that came. I think to be humble, I've heard, not everything can be solved through outcomes-based financing, but I think there is another piece where we can be very humble, is that we don't, perfect is the enemy of done. So basically when we start, it's okay, the price maybe is wrong, fine. If you talk with people who works in contracts and law, every contract is incomplete by definition. So sometimes we're setting ourselves targets that are higher than a normal, in other private sector and investment business. So we don't have to be more perfect than perfect. So the question sometimes, what we are expecting from service provider to learn, through this type of different financing, why don't we as outcome funders, investor do the same? That we also learn through the process and maybe renegotiate or relook at certain things. I loved also the piece about it's a thing to the thing. So what to the thing is this a thing? I think for different people differently. For an NGO, if I was today leading an NGO, I would definitely do it. Look, you do a project for $270,000. It costs you a lot of headache and management attention. But if, after 3 years, it allows you to show the result and put you on the world stage and get $70 million plus, that's quite a good leverage of your time, I would say. So I encourage people, even if they think, I don't want to do small and maybe it's complex, the question is, what is the long-term vision? What is the thing for government? I think the key is to become better commissioner for outcomes. I can share this experience many times. We talked about this. It takes time, the engagement, the conversation. We heard about the partnerships. When we worked in Ghana, it took us like 3-4 months together with governments and all the different parties to discuss what outcomes do we really care about in education and what price would be put behind such an outcome. That conversation was amazing. At the end of the conversation, I thought, even if we don't do the deal, it's fine. We've achieved a lot. And I joked with Mara once, I said, can we do all these conversations and then give them a grant? It's just like, it's just like that type. Why is it faster sometimes? Because that conversation is not happening. Because you have big aid agency going and spending $100 million on a textbook program without even talking with the government if they want to have it, and et cetera, et cetera. So the question is that partnership, that conversation that is happening could also be the thing for the thing to the government. For investors, what is the thing to the thing? I think it's also to create trust. We've heard, from Phyllis about the 4% that invest outside in the US, for example. And the question is, change happens at the speed of trust. So how can we change that behavior is by creating some track record with the data to get them to invest. And we know that data is the fuel of, for also things such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. So long term, I was smiling at long term and short term a bit because what I know today, most service providers are funded for 1 year, sometimes 2 years, if they're super lucky, 3 years. So we say we're doing long term, but when we say long term, we mean 5 to 10 years. So I do definitely think that this type of outcome-based financing is actually great because it gives you as a service provider everything you dreamed of. It gives you long-term funding, but not the long-term, the 15 or 20 years societal changes. I agree there. And flexible funding. So if you think that you don't need parental or community work, but you need actually to work on menstrual hygiene or you need a new IT system, then you can do it because basically your investor wants you to achieve the outcomes. And that's been transformational, we've heard from many. I can tell you that I was government minister after the Arab Spring in Tunisia and thought that was the hardest job of the world. After I left, I was CEO of an NGO for 2 years before I took on this role. That was the hardest job in the world because basically everything I've learned from my first job at Mercedes-Benz through BCG, through being an entrepreneur, through government minister, everything I've learned, what it makes to build a great organization, I couldn't do. You know, the maximum I got was 7% overhead. How can I build IC system? Can I build an HR system? How can I build a finance system? How can I scale? And even the US, where we are, you can't find NGOs sometimes bigger than $50 million. Do you ever hear of M&As, merger and acquisition between NGOs? Nothing, because we're keeping them poor and underfunded on purpose. So the way we pay today undermines the impact we achieve. And I think we've heard from different people here how this different type of payment can maybe change that and help them with data. We heard about IT, et cetera, to be able to scale. So this role change, so it's a kind of a big change. We've heard, should it become boring or still exciting? But it is hard. It is hard to change governments. We heard about legislation sometimes, but probably you can create funds. It's easier than changing legislation. We've heard about investors who are used to capital risk and not really to delivery risk. Is for providers who, some of them have learned to deliver activities, and it may be a bigger challenge to change into delivering in an innovative way. It's hard for agencies who've been using to be donor to maybe convene. But I think for my experience also one hard thing that came also a little bit is the language. How can we bridge languages? I've seen Christina Tora here, I don't know where she is, from the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing. She's invited me once to spend, when I started this 2 years ago, I had no idea of finance, you know? And when I was minister, I hated the minister of finance, as every minister should, you know? And I went there for 2 days. I understood almost nothing at the beginning, you know? And I was like, what is this conversation? They're not talking about people. They're not talking about challenges. What are uncorrelated returns? It means it's not linked to the stock market. So I had, what is an asset class and all these things. Now, after 2 years, I can tell you, we heard a bit from Amin Islamic Development Bank. We spent an hour in Oxford who explained to me some very interesting financial engineering, how through a few million in a grant and a few million in outcome funding, and then somehow an investor, you finance engineer that, and you leverage it to get hundreds of millions of dollars to make societal change. I mean, I was a bit proud. I could follow the conversation for an hour, even if I probably wouldn't be able to explain it now. But I found it fascinating. That knowledge we need, that knowledge I would have loved to have as a government minister. It would have made me talk differently to the finance minister. I would have loved to have as a leader of an NGO. And I'm happy I have it now because, you know, this conversation now, it's the bridging we need. We need to bridge this conversation between these investors, the financial market, and let's say the development and the government who all speak different languages. So Charlotte left, but I'd love to see Unicef and others playing that convening role she talks about to bring everyone together. And just to finalize, it is, these contracts at the end, we talked about this as PPP. I've heard this week at ANGA a different acronym, not just public-private partnership. I've heard it's a partnership for public purpose. I love this new wording, a partnership for public purpose, because I think our passion, at least mine, and I think many of this room, is how can we make government deliver better for their citizen? And this is a tool for that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning.